So I will start with the panel discussion. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Distinguished delegates, esteemed colleagues and honored guests, welcome to this side event of the 2024 Human Rights Council Social Forum titled What Funding for What Development? I'm Eva Buchholz, Social Rights Program Director at the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation in Geneva. Today we are here to confront an urgent issue: how decades of neoliberal economic policies, pushed by institutions like the IMF or the World Bank, have entrenched corporate power at the expense of fundamental human rights, including the right to development, especially in the Global South. These policies have not only eroded local economies, but have actively drained resources from those most in need, driving millions into poverty and compounding global inequality. Public debt, illicit financial flows, and unfair tax regimes deprive communities of the means to achieve essential rights and to participate meaningfully in development. This dynamic is not merely a policy oversight. It is a form of structural violence that directly undermines the realization of the right to development. The right to development, which this Council has long recognized, remains contested and unfulfilled for too many. Today's discussion is a call to reimagine the frameworks governing international finance, moving toward a model that places human rights, collective well-being and sustainability above corporate profit. Our panel today will provide insights on what is needed to bring the right to development from principle to reality. As we prepare for the 4th International Financing for Development Conference in Sevilla, this conversation at the Social Forum serves as a call to action for all participants. Together, we must envision and advocate for a truly equitable and rights-based global economic order. And I'm very happy to welcome the speakers for today's session. And I will introduce them one by one, not all at the beginning. And I will start with Mihir Parnade. Our speaker serves as a member of the expert mechanism on the right to development. Mihir's work emphasizes the right to development as a fundamental human right. He will share his insights on the legal frameworks needed to protect this right in today's economic landscape. And I would like to ask him to spell out what legal and policy shifts are needed to ensure that the right to development is realized amid today's economic and financial structures. You have the floor.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation. As was pointed out, I'm a member and the current chair of the expert mechanism on the right to development. And we are finalizing a study on mainstreaming the right to development in international development cooperation. And I think it's very relevant to the topic that we are discussing. I was struck by the title of the event, What Financing for What Development? And obviously there are two separate sets of questions here. And to answer what financing, we need to first answer what development. And to me, it's very clear that development must be defined as a human right. And from the right to development lens, it is obvious that development is not charity. When we think of development cooperation, when we think of financing, it is not generosity, it's not a privilege, it's a human right. With corresponding obligations on states. And this is not just a human rights lens. I think even economists have come to the same conclusion, and I would point here to Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate for economics, who in his book Development as Freedom described development precisely as enhancement of the well-being of all individuals and all peoples. And it's remarkable that his work in economics, which came in 1998, echoed pretty much the same terms, the same language of development in the 1986 Declaration on the Right to Development, where development is described as a comprehensive economic, social, cultural, and political process which aims at the constant improvement of the well-being of the entire population and all individuals. on the basis of their active, free and meaningful participation in development and the fair distribution of benefits resulting therefrom. It's clear that development is not GDP, development is not to be measured purely in econometric terms. It is fundamentally about the well-being of all individuals and peoples. Today, of course, we have a fancy name for this in the 2030 agenda. We call it the Leaving No One Behind principle. But if we had followed up on the 1986 declaration, we would not have to reinvent these same concepts with different names. Now, very important is the fact that the 1986 declaration does not define development. It describes development as well-being, but this is not the definition of development, because the definition of development is to be done by the rights holders. Individuals and peoples are the authors of what development means to them. It is they who define their development priorities. It is they who describe and inform the governments, at least that's how it should be, on what their development needs are. And this is to be done on the basis of their active, free, meaningful participation in development. When it comes to development cooperation, it is important that it must be aligned with the priorities of the rights holders. So national development plans must be set by countries that are based on the priorities of the rights holders. And it is important that development cooperation providers align their cooperation with those priorities, instead of determining for the recipient country what the priorities are. This is far too common in financing for development. What we have seen, including in our study, is that many donor countries, particularly from the global north, conduct their own national plans for each country that they want to support. And it's in those plans they determine already what the priority should be for the recipient country. And this obviously misaligns funding with the priorities of the recipient country. In terms of what financing, I think before we come to that, it's important to situate financing within the duty to cooperate. Okay? When we say a country is giving financing, it is important to understand that this is not charity. Donor-driven development aid, as we call it, often is as charity, which means that the donors decide the priorities, donors decide the conditionalities on which the financing will be given, donors decide the results frameworks for that, and this is not effective. This is not effective. In fact, this has been challenged by a number of authors, but also there's a recognition in something called the aid effectiveness principles that this doesn't work. We need to have country ownership. Now, in terms of financing, I think we are all familiar with the statistics that financing is clearly inadequate today for sustainable development. I won't belabor this point, but I would refer you to the Financing for Sustainable Development report of 2024, which gives a pretty damning illustration of where financing lies today. In terms of the results, we know that around half of the 140 SDG targets deviate from the required path. Alarmingly, 18% indicates stagnation, 17% regression below the 2015 baseline, so we are deteriorating. Of the 62 means of implementation targets of the 2030 agenda, 49 are off track, with progress on 10 regressing and 3 stagnating. We know that the annual financing need for developing countries alone is $4 trillion, that's the shortfall. And FDI has been dropping. Statistically, we know that countries are, 60% of low-income countries are in debt distress or at high levels of risk. The OECD's DAC countries, on average, as we know, they have committed to 0.7% of GNI towards official development assistance, and consistently since 2015 or even before. That has been about half. It's only been about 0.35% or thereabouts. So even the committed amounts are not given. But what's interesting is that even this amount of 0.37%, which was the figure last year, a substantial amount of this is attributed to costs towards donor countries spending on processing and hosting refugees. So they're spending money in their own countries for refugees and counting that as official development assistance. And of course, I mean, I won't even mention that a lot of this amount is counted as aid that goes towards Ukraine. So, I mean, in as much as that may be important, it does take away a substantial amount from countries where there is need. And all of this together amounts to 0.37%, which is almost half of the committed 0.7. But it's not about adequacy only, it's also about the quality of development, cooperation, or financing that is important. And in our draft study, which will be finalized soon, we look at a number of aspects on this. And the biggest challenge that every single institution we spoke to, including the OECD Secretariat, but also the United Nations system, UNCTAD, United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation, pointed out that the biggest challenge is that financing is not aligned with country ownership. It's not aligned with national priorities set by different countries. And again, this is a repetition of donor-driven setting of priorities. Focus on results is inadequate. National systems are not used. It's only how donors want to see, or development agencies want to see the results that often dictated. And in my work, I call this the beauty contest phenomenon, because development cooperation agencies often want to show that the work that they have done is beautiful, it's fantastic, it has achieved results, and they're competing with each other on who can show the best results. And that's the political economy of development aid industry, that no one has an interest in showing the real facts, the failure. Everyone has an interest in showing success. There's also a problem with additionality in development aid, which is that the same amounts are shown as aid for trade, as climate change financing, and as official development assistance. And in some cases, they're counted thrice, right? They're counted thrice, one on top of each other to have inflated numbers. And this came out in our study as well. We pointed out that this is an issue. Then there's the question of conditionality. Financing is often tied with aid conditions. It's not unconditional. So a big concern, which the OECD is very aware of and has been working on quite regularly, is that over half of the aid that's given is conditioned on the projects being conducted by the companies of the donor country. So if I'm funding for infrastructure, for funding for roads, the construction of the roads should be done by my company, right? So if you do the mathematics here, and I'll stop there after this example, if you do the mathematics, if I'm the donor country, my taxpayers' money is going through this long circuitous mechanism called development aid, cooperation, financing, coming to fill up the pockets of my company. But on top of that, the recipient still has to repay the principal amount with interest, because it's not a grant, it's a loan, right? So, and again, I'm the one who's setting the development priorities. So there is a lot of room for improvement in financing for development. We need to move towards a model of effectiveness-based approach towards development cooperation. And this can only be done by mainstreaming the right to development principles. Our study explains and goes into what those principles are. We also demonstrate a lot of good practices because one of the problems with our mandate is that we can't name and shape. We have to only show good practices, not bad practices. So we do show a lot of good practices with concrete examples on how the right to development principles can be mainstreamed for effective financing. And I hope that this feeds into the conference, the summit next year. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Mihir, and for spelling out so detailed how development is not only inadequate but also ineffective, the way it is being looked at today. I would now like to hand over to Todd Howland, Chief of the Development and Economic and Social Issues branch at the OHCHR. And I would like to ask him what role he sees the Human Rights Council could play in advancing a global economic model that supports sustainable development, like maybe the one that Mihir was concentrating on right now, and how that development could then also respect human rights better than development does today. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva, and thanks to the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation and Fian for the opportunity to be here with you today. Probably 25 years ago, when the High Commissioner was Mary Robinson, her first speech was titled 50 Years of Illegal Development. And she was using in her speech work done by Clarence Diaz and James Paul at the Center in Law and Development. It was the last time she spoke about the issue because the blowback from her speech was very significant. But to a large degree, the issue remained for another 25 years. And then recently, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has tried again to go back to it, perhaps in a way that we thought would work, in terms of calling it the human rights economy. And the human rights economy is all about recapturing the idea that the economy exists for the benefit of people. And this is really what, if you look back at the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, the idea of the Universal Declaration is that human rights were to apply to all aspects of society, including the economy. And so when we begin to discuss what we mean by the human rights economy and the possible role of the Human Rights Council, one, let's say the Keynesian economics that was to some degree influential during the time of the drafting of the Universal Declaration has certainly succumbed to the neoclassical economics and neoliberalism, which has replaced the idea with basically one objective. The market is there to maximize return to its shareholders, period, regardless of costs upon others. So I think that the Human Rights Council, and then the treaty bodies and special procedures and our office itself, can help create clarity on a number of issues. One, fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty is super important. Today, oddly, when you talk about fiduciary duty, it doesn't seem to include economic, social, and cultural rights or human rights. It's a bit odd. Fiduciary duty should start with the point of view that the rule of law should be respected. And then from that point forward, you can make money. I think it's very important that the Human Rights Council articulate that the fiduciary duty includes corporate actors and investment actors, and that they need to respect the rule of law, including human rights. Seems like a no-brainer, but it doesn't happen. Second, Mihir has clearly articulated the need for the definition of development and using what's already there. The Declaration on the Right to Development is quite clear about what we mean by development, and it should become what everyone understands by development. GDP includes imposition of costs and freedoms and human rights costs on others. How can that be development? I think the Human Rights Council can help to articulate the purpose of the economy. The purpose of the economy should be for the benefit of people, not some people, but all people. It should be measured in terms of its success on the level of respect for human rights of all people. Fourth, it's important that the Human Rights Council articulate that the market is not a magic solution to everything. I think a couple of examples. In investment in support and care. Today, in too many places, support and care is all about maximizing return to the particular private investor, whether that is the people providing care or the people under care. But if we want to look at it, it's about children, people with disabilities, older persons, and those that are providing care. This is an investment in our society. This is an investment in our future. It's an investment in inclusion. We can't leave this to the market solution. Another example is environment and climate change. Well, why do we have a problem with climate change? We've allowed for the imposition of costs, human rights costs, human rights, right to life, right to health, on others. And those costs should not be allowed, those should be integrated back into the equation. When we talk about education, it's not clear to me when we talk about how do we finance education, why we aren't realistic. It takes a generation to educate people. There's many studies that show how education, even if you use a GDP indicator for growth, actually facilitates GDP growth over a generation if you invest in education. But how are you going to do that if you need to pay interest on your loan next year when the people are graduating 25 years later? What kind of development system have we created? How can it be possible that we want to pay for something 25 years in advance from when it's going to have an impact? We need to change the way in which we think about development in the way in which evidence shows how it works. If they're going to get a loan, then the loan can be paid back with no interest starting 25 years later, because that will actually produce development. I'll give one more example because I've already spoke a little too long. But I wanted to, because we're coming up to COP29, and there's going to be a discussion about financing, it's absolutely crazy to think that private investment is going to facilitate a green transition. Private investment has helped create the problem, but it's absolutely resolvable. And this is absolutely something that should be done by member states and can be clarified by the Human Rights Council. No interest or low interest green bonds can solve the problem easily. Why? Everyone pays for the power they use. This is actually a development problem that's much easier to solve than education and healthcare. People will pay for the power they use. Why aren't we doing it? Well, we want to say that, well, until the green energy is competitive with fossil fuels that we've been subsidizing for the last 5 decades or more, that until it's competitive with all those subsidies, we can't actually put money into it. But if we really want to prioritize our collective future, this is absolutely resolvable, because people will be paid back, countries will be paid back for investing in green bonds that will allow for a transition and a rapid transition. And so I think that we just need to be honest about the fact when we come to the human rights economy, that the market produces some useful results and some problematic results, and we need to extract some things from the market in order so that we can actually respect human rights. So thanks.
Thanks a lot, Todd, for these very obvious examples that don't seem to be so obvious for decision makers, unfortunately, at the political level. And I would now like to turn to David Boyce, to my right, who's the Deputy General Secretary of Public Services International and brings a wealth of experience in labor rights and public services advocacy. And I would like to ask him to share his insights on the role of public services in equitable development financing and the risks posed by privatization, which we've already heard about, and how it undermines public well-being.
Thank you, Eva, and thanks to RLS, FIAN, and CITIM for bringing us all together for these important conversations. To be clear, I work for and here represent millions upon millions of working women and men in public services. We're a trade union federation. We've been around since 1907, and we're in the 160 countries where labor rights are respected and workers are allowed to collectively advance their rights and interests. I think the comment on the beauty contest, every time I see a World Bank document or an OECD document, it's all pictures of smiley people. And it's like, it kills my printer because I'll only read so many pages, so I have to, but it is a total reality. And basically, much of what I've said, Todd, I'm not really happy with your presentation because you've basically stolen all my arguments. And I think you probably went on our website and read them, but no, I'm just kidding. One of the things I did, my accent shows that I'm from Canada, but in about 7 or 8 countries, workers' pension funds have accumulated huge amounts of capital, and we are always told that our fiduciary responsibility is limited to a risk-adjusted rate of return, that we must seek out the biggest return for our investment. And that has led a whole bunch of pension funds representing public service workers to invest in privatization, because they are shown by a number of asset managers, including now the biggest dog on the block, BlackRock, that they can make more money than a normal mutual fund by investing in privatized services. Because the nature of a lot of public services is that A, they're either a monopoly, like your water and sewage system, or an oligopoly, which means you can't have that many institutions providing it, whether it's in energy and education and healthcare and a range of others. And so basically the for-profit sector loves it because we are a captive market, and we will spend for those public services that we find essential. And as I said in a meeting just prior to this, organized by the Global Policy Forum, I think that universal access to quality public services is one of the main building blocks of the enjoyment of human rights. And if you just unpack that statement, you will see how much of that is true and how much of it is still ahead of us. My specialty in PSI has been fighting the privateers, where governments basically abdicate their responsibility, but a lot of them do it because they don't have enough money and they have to go to the market to borrow, and the market, especially for developing countries, is usurious. In other words, charging huge interest rates for governments who are trying to meet the needs. So the governments then privatize, and there's many forms of privatization, and then the corporations, as Todd said, exist to maximize profits in the shortest time possible, and to return as much of that to their shareholders. Now, quick question in the room. Anybody from the UK here? Anybody who gets their water from Thames Water? Yeah, oh, poor Carol. This was one of the beauty contests of Thatcher. She wiped out the debts of the public utility, privatized it free of money to various companies, to the extent that today it's owned by private equity. They have withdrawn so many profits from the water utility, from Maria, your water company, that your water company can no longer treat the shit that they're responsible for treating. Sorry for being blunt. And so they're dumping and polluting tons of beaches and waterways because rather than investing in what they need to have done, they've been siphoning off the money to their shareholders. This is the model of private equity especially, but it's also just a corporate reality. And I think Todd touched on most of those challenges and those issues that governments face when they let the for-profit sector take over your care. We now hear the care economy. So basically, if you got money, you get care. If you ain't, tough luck. And so for us, the point is we've got to understand why there's privatization, who's driving it, what its impact is on workers, clearly, where they outsource us and screw our wages down, and on the environment, on tariffs, on access, and on quality. And so for this, and we've heard of the need to figure out development in a way that is responsive to the needs of people and planet, because nature is showing us that when we don't respect her rights, she's going to stomp on us. And for us, one of the things we're looking at, there's a couple. One is remunicipalization, taking back into public hands those privatized entities. Another is building public-public partnerships between public utilities, but more help and peer training and learning. And that is actually taking off. And then finally, it's looking at national development banks. There's a ton of national development banks who don't behave like commercial banks in that they don't have to maximize profits. They can look out, as was said, they can look out for 25 years. They can be given a strengthened mandate by their governments. But in order to do that, and any of this requires that we as citizens, as family members, as workers, that we get active, we're more aware, and we put pressure on our democratic institutions. To me, that's the key lesson that we have to take out of this. And I know that on many of these fights, the public service workers are organizing, are mobilizing, and we're spending a lot of effort on training, on knowledge exchange, and we want to join with as many allies as possible. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, David, for these very good examples how public services should be available and accessible to the public, and how they are not today. Now, last but not least, I would like to turn to Jane Nalanga. She's the Executive Director of Seatini and a member of the Coordination Group of the Civil Society Financing for Development Mechanism. And I would like to ask her to outline how the financing mechanisms impact, the current financing mechanisms impact economic sovereignty and development efforts in African nations, and what changes she believes are most urgent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Rosa-Luxemburg and Fian for organizing this meeting. But I would also like to thank the previous speakers because I'm just going to add on to what they have said, because I agree entirely regarding the issue of the financing mechanisms in place and their impact on our development. When you look at the financing mechanisms which have already been addressed by the previous speakers, the issue of the loans, all our countries are indebted. My country, Uganda, our budget, I think our budget, we depend on loans almost 70%. Of our budget is from loans, and as has been pointed out, the interest rates by David, the interest rates are very high, and so as you pointed out, there are also issues of conditionalities. So you find that our governments are squeezed in what they can be able to do, the policies they can be able to take, and also the decisions which have to be taken in regard to growing the economy. In Uganda, we have the conditionalities around what government should spend on. The austerity measures are back in full force. When they tell us about fiscal consolidation, and fiscal consolidation is about mobilize more resources. That means regressive taxes, because there is a very aggressive system of raising taxes. So fiscal consolidation is about raise more money but spend less. And when it comes to spending less, it the areas which are most affected are the social services, health and education, and water. And because the interest rates are very high, we are spending almost 33% of the resources we mobilize to servicing that debt. So that means that we are in a perpetual state of indebtedness. We borrow, we use, we continue borrowing, and sometimes we borrow to pay. Debt has raised the issue of PPPs as also a way of financing, which has been also put on the table. But PPPs we have found in Africa that government, again in the public-private partnerships, government puts in a lot of money, but all the risks go to the public. And we have seen a lot of privatization of hospitals and PPPs. So you find that there's little sovereignty when it comes to what government can be able to do in such circumstances. So moving forward, what needs to be done? One, we can't do away with loans. We still need loans. So the debt crisis is still with us. But I think, as has been pointed out, we need longer term loans, and also some concessional loans. It's really important. I was reading somewhere there are developed countries who are still paying their loans for the Second World War. Yet for us, we have loans which we need to pay for 5 years, 10 years. Yet we are looking at development which is long term. So we need to address the terms of the loans. They need to change. I think another area which hasn't got traction here, which hasn't been discussed a lot, is the issue of growing our economies, national economies, so that we can be able to generate resources internally. For me, I think my position really is that we need resources from outside. We need ODA, we need debt relief, we need SDRs, we need them. But I think the most important issue, if we are to move forward, if we are to ensure sustainable development, which is sustainable, we need to generate resources internally. We need to increase production and productivity. We need to industrialize. We need to ensure that women who are in agriculture get a fair income, And for me, I think development is also about living in dignity. You produce, you have a decent job, you have a decent market for your produce. We are looking at increasing incomes sustainably at household level, but also at national level, so that governments can be able to provide services. There is a discussion here, and ongoing discussion about reforming the international financial architecture so that it's fit for purpose. I think here we need also to agree what's that purpose, because we just say we are fit for purpose. For me, I think what's the purpose is to be able to enable all countries to generate their own resources, to grow their economies. For me, I think that's really important, and that's why we need to look at reforming not just the financial architecture, but the entire global economic architecture, the WTO, the entire trading system, so that we can be able to end the commodity dependence. Because lastly, for me, I think that the injustice in the global economic system is where countries like all LDCs are commodity dependent. They export raw commodities, but they import finished commodities. If we don't address that trade deficit, even if we inject resources from outside, the problem is going to continue. I just want to give an example with a HIPIC initiative, way back end of 1990, beginning of 2000. Developing countries were forgiven all their loans, a lot of under the HIPIC, highly indebted poor countries. But within no time, we are back where we were, in an even worse debt crisis. It's because we are not producing anything. We are in that debt imbalance, that inequity, in that state where the ends are not meeting. So for me, I think when we are looking at reforming the international financial architecture and all this innovative financing we are talking about, it has to go to the real economy, ensure that there's increased production, productivity, industrialization. But that will also require reforming the entire range of policies, from trade policies, financial policies, investment policies, technology, because we need technology, but the policies around technology also have to be reformed. So it's a wide range of policy reforms which we need to embark on. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Jane, for painting that picture that is like pretty big. I know that Mehe has to run. Yes.
Thank you so much. I do need to run because I have a panel at 3 p.m. But I'm going to say something there which I already want to share with you. I think there is a very good case to start taxing the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Banks around the world are taxed. There is no reason why the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund should not be taxed. They're extremely profitable ventures, but go scot-free when it comes to taxation. The amounts that can be driven from there in order to fund United Nations, we're always in a liquidity crisis. The World Bank and IMF are specialized agencies of the United Nations. They do have and should have a role in funding the parent organization, which is the United Nations. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Do you also have to run, or are you? Okay. No, because I know there are a couple of questions from the audience. Oh. I know there are a couple of questions from the audience. We can still add like another 5 minutes, if that's okay with the three of you. So yeah, I know that Fian wanted to comment more than a question.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the inputs. All very relevant and very in line. I would love to have more to discuss, but it's nice. I just want to emphasize on the importance to really expand the state's fiscal space through the tax reforms, including the global one, because this is the only way in which we can ensure that the public services that are needed for human rights are in place for all human rights. And therefore, I think we should really support the Finances for Development Civil Society mechanism on this effort and others. And I would like, in the terms of privatization, David, to say that sometimes privatization is very evident on public services, but sometimes not so evident. And in the sector of food, we are seeing how social protection for food is being dismantled by states while taken by corporate-led food banks, which sell the idea of combating waste, but in reality are getting support for overproduction that is polluting more and contributing more to the planetary environmental crisis. Maybe going back to the tax convention, sorry, I think it's, we mentioned in the plenary that at FIAN we are considering to propose a tax for global landlords, which are mainly transnational companies like Cargill and others of the same level. They should also pay taxes, and these taxes could be used, for example, for land distribution, which will be anyways needed in the context of the climate change and the additional pressure that climate change puts on that. But also for the transition to agroecology, which is needed, taking into account that a third of the CO2 emissions come from the agro-industrial system. I wanted to say to Mr. Canade, who is now not here, that I agree that development can not only be measured by the results that are imposed by the donors, but that it is important also to look into structural and procedural indicators also by the donors, because sometimes the development we want, and which is based on human rights, is not possible because the structures and processes by the donors do not allow it, including the participation that he was mentioning. And another aspect very connected to what Jane said is the importance of the restructuring of the international financial institution. It is very important that this decolonizes the system, that is more inclusive, but maybe beyond that also we have to think how to solve the problem of the trade-off between the Security Council reform and the IFI's reform, which was two reforms states were playing in the Pact of the Future negotiation, no? So some countries want to reform the Security Council, others the international financial institutions, but they block each other. And this has to be in some way stopped. And just to finish, I think what Honduras said on the floor regarding the impact of the international dispute settlement mechanisms, ISDS, on the budgetary capacity of the states is an important thing. We have observed, for example, in Colombia last year, there were demands on over $12 million against the Colombian state. This is the budget of one ministry. And it means that this money will not be dedicated to human rights, and these cases are decided by private adjudicators that apply commercial law. So these cases should go out from these mechanisms and go to human rights adjudicators that understand which is the impact on the states. I finish here, just some seeds for thought.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ana Maria. Are there any other comments or questions? Yeah?
Yes, Boris Engelsson. I'm a journalist freelance here. If I am not mistaken, Rosa-Luxemburg did not like very much the one-sided propaganda rhetorics which Lenin favored. What do you think she would say of today's session?
Any other questions or comments? No. So I give the three of you the opportunity to respond to what Ana Maria raised, and maybe also think about what Rosa-Luxemburg would say today before I conclude. Who wants to start? Jane?
I was meaning you or something.
Yeah.
But I think it is important that we reflect in terms of, why we are here today. 75 years really after the creation of the international financial institutions to supposedly facilitate development. And that I think it was Mahir or David, I can't remember, or maybe all the speakers, I think. What's the purpose of development? And I think that it is extremely important that we reconnect to human rights, the idea of development. And that there might, if you want to look at the resistance to the right to development, it might relate also to the resistance to the reforms of the international financial institutions and beyond. And so I think that it is critical that we reassert the relevance of human rights in the economic sphere, And I think that would be something that most people here could agree on. That's mine.
Okay, thank you so much for those comments. And I think what's really coming out is the need for a holistic approach to the reforms we are talking about. When we talk about fiscal space, I think we should be talking about the entire range of policy space. And when we are talking about restructuring the institutions, the WTO should be added on the IFIs. And the issue of ISPS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement, very, very important and very, very bad. That means we need also to reform the entire investment policy. So we need a holistic approach. For the FFD4, we need to look at that whole range of policies. Thank you.
Again, thanks for your patience. And look, I mean, I had a comment about the rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch's. In the previous panel, I wonder who gave them their mandate and how come they get to decide who is worthy of investment and who isn't. Clearly for us, everything starts with strengthening our public institutions, not weakening them. We've been weakening them for, since the 70s, basically. And I gotta say, I'm glad I don't have to deal with Cargill, Monsanto, and those other agricultural giants. Everything I hear about them and the people who end up working under them directly or indirectly is totally miserable. And these are the people who put their lives to feed us every day. So more power to FIAN and to the agricultural workers unions, because those companies are monsters. Thanks.
Okay, so thanks a lot to our speakers today and also to that comment. So I think what I take away from here is that it's not about minor reforms, it's about fundamental shift in how we approach financing for development and also the topic of development in general. And yeah, that it is our collective responsibility, I think, to change and challenge those structures, because they perpetuate inequality, and we need to push for an economic model that truly serves the people and not just the profit. That has been very clear. And I think, yeah, today, maybe with that conference in Sevilla coming up, we have an opportunity to work towards a world where development, dignity, and human rights are coming together as a reality for all. And I like that proposition to tax the World Bank and the IMF. That would be like something very new, I think, in the policy discussions around the world. Yeah, I don't know about Rosa-Luxemburg. I think, let alone all the money that is currently being spent on the military instead of public services or development structures, she'd probably be very sad that there hasn't been much achieved over the last 100 years. And yeah, it would be interesting to have a conversation with her about this. Yeah, but I think she would still try to battle for it, and I think that's what we should all do as well. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you.
Yeah.